Hello student. Today I'm going to discuss in this course BGS 00011. The topic is Mapping Sexualities Part 1. As you know, in block 1, the unit 3 is dealing with mapping sexualities, and there are multiple levels and the cultures, the ways in which this debate emerge in India and across the world. So let me briefly point out what are the objectives of this lecture. We are trying to understand by defining what is sexuality, discuss and analyze sexuality across time and period, cultures and society with reference to class, status and politics. Generally, the term sexuality elicits responses that have to do with biology. This is whether as an area of the study or as a set of ideas people have about their intimate lives, is sexuality too easily detached from the social context where it belongs and presented as something of itself. So there are four kinds of one would say that the proposition which one can go ahead dealing with this concept. A is that sexuality are biologically derived. It have been historically stable, for instance, same since down of the time, and are essentially about the private lives and basically the same across different culture. Now, there are few words in this four, aspect which I said, and quote unquote, I'm, put it into double inverted comma to make you understand these debates. So this lecture, in fact, intended to outline about sexuality cannot be understood on its own terms. It seeks to emphasize that we cannot meaningfully begin to deploy it for whatever purposes we have in mind, activism, scholarships, etc. Until we can comprehend fully, that is nothing but an empty vessel filling up with the diversity of the meanings, beliefs and action depending on historical, social and cultural context. Hence, we can only productively engage with this topic through understanding the different contexts which influences it, rather than insist that it constitute a world unto itself. We tend to see both inflict insignificance and downplay its role as a social process by treating it as a private. So, for example, if you're a bad cook, it is a minor blemish, but being bad may seem in some cultures as a major crisis which requires intervention. And I just wanted to cite few examples, like as you see that women constantly keep cooking, but a woman who cooks bad food, again it's the family will just immediately point it out. So you can relate this debate in order to understand the examples in your everyday life. So it is ironic, and I wanted to bring out here Sigmund Freud, who born in 1856 and died in 1939, and his remarkable contribution in order to understand this concept of sexuality, whose writings were fundamental to providing a new non-biological directions in the study of sexuality in the West, firmly believed that sexuality was subjected to the biological derives. Despite literary, historical, artistic, and other evidence that suggested that sexuality, both its expression and control, is fundamentally linked to the context such as class, religion, wealth, and gender norms, we nevertheless tend to delink it from these social realities. So, if anything, we can incline to think of these aspects as incidental, choosing to believe that underneath it all, that looks a fundamentally fixed essence and drive we can identify as a sexuality. So the kinds of questions we need to explore are, while studying can we regard sexuality as a fixed concept that can be easily understood both across different time periods and different cultures? Or is it a made up of most diverse contexts of the social and cultural life, registering changes as this change? European theorists of the topic, such as Michel Foucault in 1990s, have suggested that sexuality as a clearly demarked field of the study and debate emerged during the early 18th century through a combination of the medical, legal, educational, and other discourses. I would, in fact, recommend to you to read Michel Foucault's series of books on sexuality, which are there available, and also the most important theorist Judith Butler. For instance, her very famous book Gender Trouble. You need to, as you get engaged with this debate, you can read those books also. So that is to say that certain ideas regarding sexuality that did not earlier exist emerged during this period, that the emergence of these ideas was linked to the ways in which sexual behavior was sought to be understood and controlled by a variety of experts such as doctors, judges, and teachers. This in turn lead to the emergence of a different categories of sexual beings such as the homosexual, heterosexual, and the reproductive family, etc. Soon after, Foucault suggested sexuality became focused on the family. That is to say, an entire range of experts. As I mentioned already, doctors, secretaries, priests, teachers, etc. Concentrated their attention on family and advising against the period of the bad sexuality and ensuring as a good health. So through these processes, the family was both sexualized and acted as an agent of sexualization. That is, it becomes a benchmark for the topics such as good and bad sexuality, healthy sexual behavior. So in this way, Foucault suggested that sexuality become a very important topic of discussion rather than being banned from being discussed or repressed. As it is commonly a thought that good sexuality within the family, reproductive sexuality, able to produce a suitable labor force, then become a part of the development of the capitalism. So, however, the key point to retain is the social and historical nature of the sexuality. There is one final point to consider that also relates to the ways in which the topic of sexuality is researched. From a social science perspective, sexuality remains an area of the study, perhaps even more than other kinds of the social behavior, where any degree of the methodological, precision is impossible to posit. So this perspective differs from that shared by the medically trained sexologists and others who offer a scientific point of view. This follows from the perspective that we must rethink the truth of our sexuality perspectives as well as biologism that has historically affected sexuality studies. In the West, this debate emerged way back, say that, 1960s onward when the second wave feminism was there. And the radical feminism, in fact, as long as they were debating about, the attack on the patriarchy and its relationship, but at the same time, they are the one, in fact, who brought out this eventually a debate which emerged in the West first. And, the number of wonderful studies related with the masculinity, femininity, sexuality, bisexuality, lesbian, gay studies, or overall one would say that queer studies, it emerged from them and they are far ahead compared to India, because in India the sexuality studies is most recently developed. I would say that first 2 decades but we are still engaging and trying to grapple, because for instance that as I mentioned to you that the research, in the context of research, we do not have the ways in which that the Western universities are having a separate discipline called sexuality studies. We do not yet have those kind of departments or centers which are dealing with these issues very seriously. At the same time, the new scholars are emerging in these areas, and they are the one in fact sort of contributing in the Indian context and trying to locate this debate. I mean, for instance that if you look at the very fundamental book by Ruth Vinita, one would see that, and also that the judgment like 377 repealing of that, one would still say that one step ahead we have gone legally, but still there is a sort of block in the mindset of the people. So the coming back to this debate again, the former says that a sexual behavior ought to be judged according to certain norms. B, there is an underlying truth lies that we must understand. For example, the gay Gwen explain homosexuality, sexual orientation is the fixed trait, men have uncontrolled sexual drives, etc. So, biologism is the study of the sexuality, as already indicated above, is connected to the views that is sexuality can be explained by the recourse to a set of unchanging bodily essence and drives. Hence, just as we tend to think that our genders are biologically determined, so too we assume that lives unfold according to an inner biological template. This connects to two other ideas. Firstly, we think of the term of expressing as if it is an essence that simply appears through its own natural logic. Another point of view would be to say that we enact selves, that is, it is learned behavior, and secondly, we too easily assume that underneath our visible differences such as class and status, the same sexual derives and so on. Now, Jeffrey Weeks in 2003 points out that, and I quote from his work, the real problem does not lie in whether homosexuality is inborn or learned. It lies instead in the question, what are the meanings of this particular culture gives to homosexual behavior, however it may be caused, and what are the effects of these meaning on the ways in which individuals organize their sexual lives, unquote. So, moving beyond medicalized approach to the sexuality and those that derive from the quantitative sciences, we can identify certain other frameworks that have sought to capture the social and cultural complexities within which sexual cultures are located. The Marxist approach, for example, suggests that we primarily view sexuality as a series, it's a series of economic relation of the domination and exploitation. So, Marxists would argue then that the heterosexual family is a key site of the support for capitalist relation of the production, in as much as it facilitates the sameness reproduction of the labor force that is socialized into an unquestioning acceptance of social and economic inequalities. The overwhelming emphasis on the economic within Marxist approach does not, however, do justice to the various other matrix of sexual cultures. For instance, that how do we account for non-heterosexual cultures, for example. The psychoanalytical approach to the sexuality derives from the pioneering writings of the Sigmund Freud on this topic. As I already mentioned to you, but you must have a look at his original work. And of course that feminists offer a critique to Sigmund Freud, that is another issue, but one must engage with this the original phenomenal work. So these approach emphasize the role of the multiple levels of the consciousness in making of the sexual slave. Hence, the psychoanalytical approach would suggest that the sexual behavior and the thought is mere and the surface activity that marks the deeper fear, anxieties and desires. Notwithstanding its interest in exploring the influence of the social environment in the making of the human sexuality. Freudian psychoanalysis nevertheless proceeds from the assumption that sexuality derives from deeply embedded biological drives. The drive model is increasingly being replaced by the relational and object relations perspective. So these may retain some of the essentialism of the drive theory, but have also drawn upon the writings of Foucault, feminism and the postmodernism to seriously rethink their earlier models. Feminist frameworks of the analysis posits the historical subordination of the woman as the fundamental ground for analysis. The feminist approach cut across all analytical contexts, providing important ways of understanding the role of the gender power in making of human relation. Another approach is referred to as the social constructivist approach. Here, sexuality is explored through focusing upon its constructed nature, that is the different forms it takes according to the different social and historical circumstances. So this approach moves away from notion of fixed and inner derives towards ideas regarding consent flux in human behavior and identity. The approach has been criticized for downplaying the role of biology. So what is important to remember is that biology always operates in a tandem with social and cultural realities, and it is this combination that produces different ways of being. This way of posing the issues avoids constituting biology and culture as totally unrelated realms on biology as prior to culture. It is also served to emphasize the fact that we became human only in human society. Precisely because sexuality is learned behavior, it differs across different times and different cultures. Hence, there is no universal category of the sexual that holds true across all times and across all cultures. What is erotic in one culture might not be regarded as such in another culture. So this way of thinking about the topic also avoids thinking in terms of the norms that can, particular context of the sexual preference, behavior and desire is better than another. So finally, within context, while it is important to avoid biological reductionism, we should also avoid the trap of the absolute difference. So approaches that seek to posit an absolute difference between Western and non-Western concept and identities are problematic in themselves. The long history of the interaction between different cultures suggests that though the specificities of the history and culture are important, we should also be mindful that contemporary identity politics is played out in the zones of interaction that are characterized or shaped by the ideas and the behaviors from diverse sources and processes, including globalization. Hence, as an anthropologist has pointed out, and I quote this from one of the known anthropologists, that rather than trying to rescue the image of the purely indigenous sexuality distinct and untainted by outside Western influence, it is more useful to to ask what kinds of interaction, connections and the conflicts emerge in the porous zone. And let me then sort of conclude by saying this, that at different cultures, the ways in which that this debate emerge, one needs to understand. Like for instance, that we derive this concept initially from the West, and as I already mentioned to you that the question of the sexuality, it is first, if we look at the second wave feminism from the West in 60s, it is a time that one would see that the radical feminists are in fact attacking the patriarchy, but there is a direct correlation with the sexuality which they tend to raise this question. For instance, that when we talk about the sexuality studies and when we look at mapping the sexualities, I think at different cultures, if we look at LGBTIQ movement, for instance, in India and the West, you would see that there is a distinct character and the difference which one can make out. For instance, that they are far ahead of time, and the kind of studies and research which we are emerging. I'll just cite for instance some of the examples, like for instance that if you look at some of the institutions from the West who are specifically doing these kind of studies with these kind of disciplines, you would see that for instance that today when we are debating about entrepreneurship in India, how do we locate this debate? How many of us raise this question and sort of promote the lesbian or the gay or LGBTIQ categories in order to bring out them into mainstream? In the West, that the studies have been done, there is also certain kind of the policy incorporation which in fact dealing with these issues and try to bring them into forefront by putting them their question together. And you would see that for recently I came across with wonderful study that how the gay entrepreneurs are helping each other. On one hand, you would see that they are contributing to the nation state, right? But at the same time that they are creating their own histories also in some ways, and trying to make a landmark contribution for the community also. I think that the time has come that we need to engage with this debate. We need to make we need to try to reflect upon these issues and try to educate our children and bring out this debate in a more vibrant way, that we can sort of try to put an effort to establish an egalitarian society. Thank you.